We are currently in an era of video games where you can't look left or right without seeing an iconic game receive a remake or remaster or even just a new unchanged port. This recent trend could be attributed to many factors, something I won't get into too deeply right now, but all of which are typically related, in my opinion, to modern hardware and development cycles. Games take longer to make, and for a long time games were releasing on hardware they really shouldn't have done. 17 frames per second? Anyway, this means that many games get remasters on the hardware they were actually designed for in an attempt to boost sales and release them on the one they shouldn't have done and get everyone to buy the game twice. Either that or a game gets a full remake in the hopes of sparking the nostalgia muscles in seasoned gamers. It's easier to develop a remake for a game that's a proven hit than it is to take a gamble and create something new. Obviously this sucks. But back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, remakes and remasters weren't a common thing, which is why Rayman 2 is an interesting case study. The game launched on Nintendo 64 originally and famously had a ton of versions that I'll go into deeper in another video perhaps. But over a year later, the game released under a different name on PS2 as Rayman Revolution. Now the word remake is tricky here. Some call it a remake, but I've always found it's a bit disingenuous. To me, a remake is building a game from the ground up following the blueprint of the original, like Resident Evil 4 or Crash Bandicoot. So I'm almost more inclined to call Rayman Revolution a remaster. But even then, that doesn't really do it justice, because it's more like an expansion. A remaster would just be upscaled rendering. It's hard to say, but you'll see what I mean. The game takes the original N64 game and makes fantastic use of the new power hidden in the PS2. Instead of a small linear level select screen, Rayman Revolution features a full hub world with lumps to collect, organic entrances to levels, mini-games, and characters to talk to. It really sets the game apart from the original version and cements itself as a 6th generation game. In addition to this, the graphics are boosted. Everything looks a bit nicer with more elements on screen at once. The levels have more environmental details about them. It's nice. When it comes to levels, they're actually a little bit different. For the most part, everything is there, with the occasional level being turned into a minigame, so it's still there, it's just a different format. The LOM placement is different, and most levels have extra rooms or areas to explore, which is nice. A lot of levels on this version are made up of 2 Frankenstein levels from the original game, so it's a little bit of a different experience playing certain levels, let's say. There are also some instances where the levels can be played not linearly, if that makes sense. What I mean is you'll have the choice between 2 levels sometimes, so you don't always have to do each one in the same order every time. Obviously, you still have to play each level at some point. Between some levels are extended segments in the hub world with exploration or combat sections. It really ties the game together and gives it a somewhat stronger narrative, though this could be subjective. There are also some extra boss battles which are a great addition, so while the game is fundamentally built around the same levels as Rayman 2: The Great Escape, there is a lot more to see and experience. What would you class it as? A remake, remaster, expansion? It's a really unique situation, you don't often see this. So what's all this about demakes in the video title and thumbnail? Well, in addition to the numerous ports of the main game and the expanded edition on PS2, Rayman 2 actually had a severely cut down version released on PS1 just before Rayman Revolution. Demakes are a strange thing. For the most part, they're a fun little concept piece made by fans, but on rare occasions a developer will make a limited version of their game for older hardware and release it under the same name. I don't mean the way handheld ports used to be, where the main game and the DS game would be barely related in any way, but what I mean is it was more or less the same game with just enough cut out to make it function. Think Mortal Kombat 1, but even worse. Where MK1 cuts the graphics down to work on the Switch, a real demake strips the game of levels and features. The easiest way to explain this is just to look at the Rayman 2 demake. Unlike the PS2 port, Rayman 2 for the original PlayStation looks rough. It looks like a worse version, that's for sure, which might seem a bit strange, because the PS1 and the N64 are both from the same console generation, so surely they'd run the games similarly? But back then there was a far bigger gap in hardware capabilities than we are seeing now with the modern Xbox and PlayStation consoles. So to get games running on both N64 and PS1 was a much harder job, as the hardware was significantly different and harder to develop for. As such, they had to change Rayman 1. Quite a lot, actually. The first thing to note is the graphics, as already mentioned. It looks worse, because it has to. Simple. Textures are lower quality, 3D models are far more jaggedy, elements like water are totally different, numerous levels are missing as well as gameplay features. As such, the LUM count for this version of the game is only 800 rather than the usual 1000. In addition to missing levels, some are heavily truncated or merged with others. And in said levels, the LUM placement is again mostly different. Interestingly enough, some levels have extra sections added in that aren't present in the other versions, so it's unique enough in its own right. Oh, and then the cages that used to hold lums now hold various creatures, so it's different, it has its differences. And while it is pretty different to the original Rayman 2, it's even further removed from the PS2 Enhanced Edition, which kind of went the other way. What's more is both versions feature full voice acting, something no other version of the games have. But for some reason the voice acting is different between these two, which is really weird.
Not really. I feel weak and my powers have disappeared. Not really. I feel weak and my powers have disappeared.
Why not just use the same one? And why, when they were cutting content for the PS1, did they feel they needed to add voice acting? Surely they could have saved another level or kept something else in, instead of squeezing those audio files onto the CD. On top of all this, if you achieve a certain % completion of the game before completing it, you'll be treated to an extra playable demo for the original Rayman 2, which was planned to be a direct 2D sequel to the first. That is a very cool tidbit, and unique to this version. Oh, and speaking of the end of the game, the final boss fight is... we don't talk about the final boss fight. To be honest, we don't talk about the final boss fight of Rayman 2 anyway. I feel sometimes like I'm the only person that likes it, and even then, it's not great. Of course, there are way too many changes between these two versions to possibly go through them all in this video. I mean, it'd be crazy to make a 2-hour video comparing every single difference between every single copy of Rayman 2. Coming soon to a channel near you. Anyway, I absolutely adore Rayman 2 and all of its versions, even the more slightly questionable ones. And I've always found it so fascinating that this game had a remake and a demake. You can't say that for many games. In terms of which is the best, well, the very best version of Rayman 2 is neither of these. I'm sorry. We'll get into this in that other illustrious 2-hour video, but in my opinion these two versions each lack something major and it's not the same thing. In a more obvious regard, the PS1 port is just missing a large amount of the game. Quite frankly, that's it. It's missing a lot of what makes Rayman 2 Rayman 2. But the PS2 Expanded Edition kind of loses some of the charm the original Rayman 2 had that's still present in the PS1 version. It's hard to express because so much of it is still charming, I'm not saying it's not. But with the added battles and open world segments, it kind of taints the linear adventure Rayman 2 tries to deliver. That's a really poorly worded way of me saying that I think it does too much to distract from what really made Rayman 2 fantastic. It almost tries too hard to be a typical PS2 game, forgetting it was fundamentally designed for the N64 and fits those limitations beautifully. I don't know. I know there are people out there who prefer Rayman Revolution, and I completely get that. It's a very different experience, and it's not for me to say it's bad in any way, absolutely not. It's just not what I'm looking for when I want to play Rayman 2, I suppose, is what I want to say. In terms of comparing these two versions though, the remake and the demake, what I'm going to say will be controversial because I prefer the PS1 port. Calm down, calm down. The reason being, I have played Rayman 2 more times than I can possibly count. Now on every system I could find as well. That took a while and wasn't cheap. And I guess Rayman Revolution just feels like the same game but with more bells and whistles to distract you from it. Whereas the PS1 port is kind of a different beast. The levels are far more different than the PS2's are in comparison to the main version, and the LUM placement being shaken up a bit kind of makes this version of the game feel like a new game. You know, different levels and different LUM placements. I can't complete this with my eyes closed like I can the other versions. Obviously it's not a new game, and a lot of it is very, very similar, but you have to understand that for me, I spent most of my life playing this game, the original version, the main version, and loving it, wishing there was more of it. So it was a tremendous delight for me to experience Rayman 2, and for it to feel new, even if it was a downgraded version. It's one of my favourite games, and after 20 years, a brand new experience to me is awesome. So while I can't call it a good port, I can't deny that my time with the PS1 port was just better than my time with Rayman Revolution, which was more samey than anything, and actually a tad disappointing. That's not to say Rayman Revolution is bad, don't get me wrong, I very much like it, it's just, I don't know, I guess it's just not for me. And I know that's weird, saying I don't like the remake but I do like the demake, but you know, I think that's what fascinates me most about demakes. They're rare, but when they happen, they're often far more creative than a remake. Remakes set out to make the game look and feel very modern with a few creative liberties, you know, bells and whistles here and there, removing any kind of colour grading. Whereas a demake is designed to make the game run on older hardware, opting for far more creativity in cutting corners and changing parts of it. It creates a far more unique experience that you're unlikely to get anywhere else because in theory, they want to avoid the game being like this. So as long as the game is playable and good, then it almost feels like a new game, and you know, if it's good and it's playable, then it's a good new game. And if I can have two good Rayman 2s, then I'm gonna be happy. Because as far as I'm concerned, if I'm a fan of a game, I'd much rather get an old but fresh experience than another run-of-the-mill graphical upgrade. Maybe that's just me. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this. Let's chat about it. I've noticed the comments on my last few videos have been fairly detailed opinions and experiences with the games I've talked about, which is awesome. So let's keep it going. So, Until next time, stay limbless, purple and awesome, and I will see you in the next video.